They're a live picture now as the sun gets ready to break over the skies of New York. The skyline itself radically changed from yesterday. A gaping hole in that skyline as the twin towers of the World Trade Center no longer standing.
Yeah, the morning after this horrible tragedy, perhaps thousands dead, and you see the sky over Manhattan starting to lighten up now as sunrise is almost upon us in New York City.
And even as we speak, hundreds of firefighters and police officers and rescue workers are digging through the rubble of what is left of the World Trade Center, trying to find survivors. We may not know for days or even weeks how many people died in that tragedy, but an estimated 50,000 people work at the World Trade Center. Some 150,000 visit there every single day, people unaccounted for, including 300 firefighters who were part of the initial rescue operation.
And good morning from the CNN Center in Atlanta. I'm Vince Cellini.
And I'm Carol Lynn. I'm glad you're joining us here. We have the very latest now on this terrorist attack on America. It's hard to believe, but just about 21 hours ago, a hijacked American Airlines Boeing 767 crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center in New York. The plane was hijacked shortly after taking off from Boston. And then minutes later, while Americans watched on televisions across the nation, a second hijacked airliner hit the Trade Center's other tower.
And not too long after these planes hit the World Trade Center, another hijacked airliner slamming into the Pentagon. This morning, emergency personnel hoping to begin searching the debris.
And then, Vince, in rural Pennsylvania, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, this scene, yet another hijacked plane crashes. In all, 266 passengers and crew died in these plane hijackings, and authorities say the planes were taken over by small groups of men. In at least 2 cases, they used knives to commandeer the aircraft. A final account of the day of terror remains unwritten. The total number of those killed is not yet known. And now, live pictures of the streets of Manhattan there, just a glimpse of the devastation illuminated by some of the lights set up for the rescue operation. You saw in the lower right-hand corner there a helicopter scanning the scene, and you can't see, though, but hundreds of rescue workers there digging through, trying to save lives, if anyone has even survived.
Yeah, working tirelessly through the night. You can see now what awaits Manhattan this morning, the day after the horror. Garrett Gutley has been with us in New York, and here again to talk about that as it is almost sunrise there in New York City. Garrett?
The light certainly there, Vince, on the horizon just beyond New York Harbor there, the bay in lower Manhattan where the tragedy occurred. And this new day, this Wednesday in September, what kind of a day is it going to be? Well, if you look at the weather forecast in the upper right-hand corner, it's going to be another beautiful day as far as the weather is concerned, just like yesterday. Sunny, a few clouds in the sky, high of 77 degrees. But that's only the weather corner. Here is the front page. Once again, let's go through the papers and just show you what has happened here. The New York Times, U.S. attack. You can't put it any more boldly than that. An 8-column headline right across the entire paper. The New York Daily News, the leading tabloid in circulation in this city, it's war, as direct as it can be. Same with the New York Post, an act of war. Sorry, get the hand out of there. With a picture still of the plane going into the tower, and the Wall Street Journal. And of course, this tragedy occurred right in the heart of the financial district of New York, the financial center of the world economy, if you will. Does terrorists destroy World Trade Center, hit Pentagon, and raid with hijacked jets? Everybody wondering what the implications are going to be of this, of course, politically, perhaps militarily one day. And yet the immediate concern, as we saw just a moment ago, is the continuing rescue effort down there in lower Manhattan. All night long, because this is indeed a 24-hour operation, the rescue efforts have been going on. Members of the fire department, disaster relief teams from the Red Cross and other organizations, the Salvation Army has been providing food down there. 10,000 meals being prepared for the rescue effort overnight and during the day that's coming. In addition to that, shelters have been set up around these rescue efforts for the hundreds, even a few thousand people who live in the area who have lost all electric power in their homes and had to be taken into shelters. Indeed, some of their homes are in jeopardy due to structural damage from the terrorist attacks. Throughout the day, there will be the rescue teams here will be reinforced by more help. 3,000 members of the New York State National Guard are will be moving into the city to take up positions to serve in any way that they possibly can to support and back up the fire department, the police, and the disaster teams there. And again, just look at it. Can you guess how long this is going to take to go through all of that? More than 100 stories twice over in the two towers crumpled down there. We know about the human loss of life. We don't know how many. We can only guess. The mayor says it'll be horrendous, in the thousands most likely. And the material damage, what's been lost there, not just buildings, but all the information, the knowledge, the computers crushed in there, memos, agendas, personal letters, correspondence, mementos, knickknacks. It's all buried there in one heap in Lower Manhattan right now.
Garrick, earlier today you mentioned some of the names of the firefighters lost, over 300 of the New York firefighters missing or feared dead here. And only now, and throughout the night, periodically, we were putting faces and names to this horrible situation. And really, that's kind of when it begins to sink in as well, yes?
It's going to sink in with the names. In a way, it's been amazing. We haven't had more names yet coming out from these various disasters that have occurred. They will be coming out this day, and that's when we will begin to put the names and the faces together. How many people are there here, as there are in Washington or in Virginia, worrying about friends or loved ones in those targets that were hit? I know my wife, friends were calling friends today to find out if they were safe. I got a call back from one of my wife's friends. She said, please tell her that she called me, she left a message in the machine, I'm all right. In fact, she said, I was fortunate, I was sick this morning, I didn't go to work in the World Trade Center. I'm at home, I've just been too shaken to call her back earlier. I think these are the kinds of calls and messages, hopefully, that'll be repeated many times as people are reassured that they're friends. Yes, indeed.
And New York City, as we mentioned, is really a city with backbone. You know, people get back to it, take on challenges, certainly none like we see here, but a city that I'm sure will brace itself, bow its neck, and just push forward.
It will push forward. And listen, Mayor Giuliani, the mayor of New York City, is a big booster and cheerleader for New York. He talks about this being the capital of the world, and it is a unique metropolis. He talks about the can-do, tough spirit of New Yorkers. But let's face facts. The heroism here, the bravery here, which is an unlimited measure, is it any greater than that shown among those people in the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania or those in the Pentagon offices? We're talking not about New York City here. We're talking about the human spirit, and we're seeing it right here in these pictures downtown. We saw what happened yesterday and what will continue to happen in these early morning hours of this Wednesday. People pulling together, and there they are.
Garrick, of course, you've been at this as a journalist for a long, long time, and I wonder, even still, as you see some of the new video coming down, you see some of this and the wreckage, just how it hits home with you, and if you could possibly filter that through yourself for us and some of the viewers.
Yes, one thing does strike me. We talk about it's war, and people there in Lower Manhattan or at the Pentagon saying it's like a war scene. Veterans saying, I haven't seen anything like this since World War II or Korea. True, in terms of the tragedy. It's not that kind of a war. This is not World War II. Things were happening in Europe and in Iwo Jima, which were in many ways far worse than this in terms of loss of life and destruction. We grope to make these comparisons. And what happened today was really so unique. It was terrorism, which usually is seen as something being very brutal, yes, but very raw, unsophisticated, crude, if you will. And I think one of the things that shocks we Americans and those around the world watching this is that this was brutal, this was grotesque, and yet it wasn't crude. It was highly sophisticated. It took a great deal of planning. This is something new, and this is what shakes us.
Yes, it was calculated and diabolical. And Garrick Utley, we appreciate your presence there and your information this morning. Thank you. Carol?
Vince, we take you now live to Washington, D.C., where it's hard to believe, but that is the Pentagon still on fire more than 21 hours after an airplane plowed through to its inner ring. CNN's Bob Franken is on the scene. Bob, what can you tell us about what's happening?
it's not really a huge surprise to the officials who've been watching this. They're in meetings right now trying to decide when they can go into the building and start assessing the loss, particularly in human terms. But they've been waiting for the fire to go out, and as you can see, it has not. There have been embers, smoldering embers by just, you know, how many tons inside this building, and every once in a while one of them erupts like you've been seeing right now. And you're seeing it, you can see it on the left side of your screen. It has flamed up again. It's quite a little distance away from where the plane actually crashed into the Pentagon yesterday. But before they can really go in there, they're going to have to be assured that there is no danger of fire erupting again. And of course, they're going to have to take a real good look-see with the light of day to see when they can start going through the rubble, when they can begin the grim task of finding out just how many casualties there are inside. There have been estimates into the several hundred, but Pentagon officials have adamantly refused to give any result. They just don't know at this particular point. Right now, it's still in the hands, as you can see, of the firefighters who are trying to put things out. It was about 9:40, I believe, yesterday morning when the plane crashed into the Pentagon. A plane that was flying from Dulles was on its way elsewhere, but then was diverted and came into that. We've been told that one passenger on the plane, someone I knew well and so many viewers of CNN knew well, Barbara Olson, was able to get hold of her husband, Ted Olson, the Solicitor General, and tell him that the terrorists had thrown the pilot out of the cockpit and had taken over the plane, and then it ultimately crashed into the Pentagon. As it had crashed, the planes had crashed into the Twin Towers in New York that we've seen so much of in the fine reporting by Gary Cutley. But here we have a situation which still is not really ready, it looks, for the officials to go in and start assessing the damage. We are told that, nevertheless, the Defense Secretary intends to open this building up this morning for business as much as he can. Of course, a bit of symbolism there. They want to show the rest of the world that the military establishment in the United States can continue to operate. But the reality is that it's only going to be about half open. They've decided that about half of this building, 17 miles of corridors in the entire building, about half of them cannot be declared safe enough structurally for people to go in and work. But about half of it is going to be open. Sure, we're going to have briefings during the day. You can be sure that there will be planning going on in this building for retaliation once officials can decide where the retaliation is aimed.
All right, thank you very much,
Thanks, Bob
Franken.
Franken.
And now we want to bring you some live video here of Manhattan and where the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center once stood. And you can see that dawn is breaking in New York City, and those New Yorkers, tough as they are, will come face to face with the devastation that was Tuesday. For some, we saw it on videotape here and around the world, but for the New Yorkers, it is all too real.
And Vince, take a look at this shot. This really gives you perspective and some context of the damage. And this next shot, I hope we can bring it up. It is, there it is, a wide shot of the damage and devastation. We are talking about two twin towers, more than 100 stories high. You know, potentially as many as 100,000 people could have been caught in that wreckage. You can still see the fire burning in the distance in the, you know, close to the upper left-hand corner there. This is being called the most devastating terrorist assault on U.S. soil in American history.
And people there hoping, as we are, hoping against hope that somehow, some way, miraculously, there's still some people that may have survived this.
That's right. Hundreds of people still unaccounted for, including some 300 firefighters who were there in the initial rescue operation when the first plane crashed into the North Tower. There you can see.
This is amazing, you know, the city skyline and how
the smoke's still rising.
How it's been altered. And it just really hits home. It's incredible.
So evident, a true symbol of financial power gone now from the horizon of New York City. And we wish those rescue workers well today. They've got a big job ahead of them and a very delicate operation should there be survivors amidst tons
just
of rubble.
working tirelessly throughout late evening and the night. Now we want to go to Michael Oku at St. Vincent's Hospital in Manhattan, and he has an update for us there.
It's been eerily quiet here in Lower Manhattan, just in front of St. Vincent's Hospital, which, as you know by now, has become the major trauma and triage center here in New York. Just to my right, you can see that there are satellite trucks and police officers and personnel of all kinds on 14th Street, just north of here, a couple blocks north. Police have set up barricades, which you cannot see necessarily from this shot, but they have set up barricades, which essentially has has limited traffic just south of 14th Street here in Lower Manhattan to a trickle of police vehicles, emergency medical vehicles, which sometimes punctuate the silent night air here, the silence here that has resonated throughout the evening. Moments ago, about an hour or so ago, we have seen now 4 victims who have been brought to this hospital. The last person we saw seemed to be a police officer, but it is not confirmed, and we do not know whether any of these victims sustained any injury that came as a result of the attack on the World Trade Center yesterday. I'm joined here by Tom Collier, who is with the University of Miami Medical Center. And Tom has been working as a volunteer, can tell us about some of the outpouring of emotional support that you've seen.
Well, the community in New York has been unbelievable, as always. Not only the national chains of food like Duane Reade and Starbucks and that kind of thing, but the local residents, people coming in and helping out any way they can, not only in products and foods, but also in time. All night long, we've had every shift covered. We're getting food to the officers and to the nurses, to the doctors. We have set up 9 coffee stations throughout the hospital just so they don't leave the area and stay with the patients, which is where they really need to be.
Can you see whether it's actually making a difference?
It's making a difference, and it's, our whole thought is if we just get 2 hands free inside by doing what we're doing, then we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, and that's what we're trying to do.
Tom, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. The hospital officials here say that they will have a press briefing at 6:30 just a little while from now, and of course we will keep you posted on that. I'm Michael Oakley reporting live from Lower Manhattan.
Thank you, Michael. We want to go back to Garrick Utley, who's at the New York Bureau with a view of the skyline. Garrick, we've been hearing stories about things being reported on New York radio, something about people calling for help on their cell phones from the World Trade Center?
We've had those reports through the evening, indeed from city officials, that they have received some cell phone calls from those trapped in the rubble. Now, we're not quite clear whether it's in the rubble of the Twin Towers that came down or buildings around it where people are trapped because of debris, and also because a 3rd building at number 7, the World Trade Center, also collapsed yesterday, late afternoon. So we're not sure where those calls are coming from, but yes, some messages have gotten through, and to the extent that the rescue effort can pinpoint where they are, they're certainly going to be going after them today.
Garrick, do you know whether they're saying how seriously they're hurt or how much danger they still feel they're in? No, we've not heard anything since the news conference last night held by the mayor, Mayor Giuliani, and other city officials. They mentioned some of these phone calls. They're being very tight-lipped. Officials everywhere do not want to give out any information that can raise hopes too much or dash them too much. They're just waiting for events to unfold. I'm sure, though, that during the course of this day we'll be getting more information about that. Sure. Garrick, do they think that these are credible calls? Well, how do we know for certain? Certainly a prankster could do it. That would be the worst, the bleakest, the darkest, dirtiest joke, if you will, if anybody tried to pull that stunt. But they believe they are credible. That's what they say. They're acting on that information. How many they are, we simply don't know. We do know, of course, earlier yesterday, even before those towers collapsed in rubble here, many people employed and working in their offices in the Twin Towers were calling friends and families, describing what was happening. And we were also told that by one of our colleagues at CNN that he had learned that one man called his wife and he knew that he was trapped right at the top and he wasn't going to get out.
Well, we will continue to hear these stories. Garrick, right behind you in your shot, we can see that it is just about daybreak there.
The sun is coming up to the east, and we want to take a look at one of the at downtown here, as you see the lower part of Manhattan and that gaping, what can we call it, void, a hole where the Twin Towers used to be. There's still a lot of dust, some smoke, but that's a mixture of dust and smoke that's in the air there, and it's probably going to continue for some time because the rescue effort itself will keep kicking up the dust.
Speaking of that, and we have some pictures of the rescue effort that's continuing right now, that would be a difficult area to access even for regular traffic, would it not, let alone trying to do some of this massive recovery that's taking place now with the heavy machinery.
When we look, you're absolutely right. When we look at downtown or lower Manhattan, we see these modern, sleek skyscrapers. It's Wall Street, the financial district. But actually, anybody who's visited realizes this is original New York City. This is where the first settlers landed. This is where George Washington was inaugurated as our first president, just a couple of blocks from those Twin Towers some 200 years ago. This is a part of town with not a grid system of streets, but tiny little streets and lanes along which they built these giant buildings filled with hundreds and thousands of workers. So in the best of circumstances, it's a perpetual traffic jam down there. Now, of course, even with traffic and pedestrians cleared away and the people having fled, you've got to move in this giant equipment. And look at the cars that are down there. Look at the debris you've got. How do you maneuver in this space? Right there we're seeing a shot. That's along one of the broader avenues running north-south. But around the World Trade Center, that's just a catacomb, just a maze of tiny roads and streets.
Garrick, in taking a look at this shot, we get a sense also of the New York Police Department's rescue crews trying to move through that area. Are you hearing whether the rescue crews themselves are hearing the voices of people who are still alive, still trapped under there? And are they giving you a sense of how long it's going to take to get anybody out?
Well, several questions. First, no estimate yet as to how long it's going to take. It's going to be days and weeks. That is absolutely certain. Question number two, any survivors? Yes. The Port Authority, that's the regional government institution that runs the World Trade Centers, or ran them, runs the airports, the bridges. It reported that 3 or 4 of its security officials had been pulled out of the rubble. Presumably they're on the fringes. They heard voices. They were able to recover those men who were wounded or injured, but they're said to be, they're going to be all right. We heard an earlier report last night that the special teams that were brought in, special handlers with dogs trained to look and smell out and sniff out humans, dead or alive, were going through the rubble, and very quickly the dogs indicated they had no scent. They couldn't get any scent. They were disoriented. Why? Because of all the dust in the air. The dust was interfering with the dogs, even with their sensitive sense of smell, to do their job. Perhaps today it'll get slightly better, we don't know, but that's another obstacle that stands in the way of the rescue effort.
All right, Garrick Utley, thank you for being our guide through this madness that is now Manhattan. We'll be checking in with you periodically. Carol?
The toughest hour still ahead, Vince. Right now, let's go to Kelly Wallace. She's standing by at the White House. Kelly, question on many Americans' minds. What sort of action is President Bush going to take, able to take? What are some of his options in responding to this crisis?
Well, definitely, as you heard President Bush say last night, Carol, he will say that the U.S. government is going to do everything it possibly can to find those responsible for these terrorist attacks. Mr. Bush also saying, though, that they will draw no distinction between those responsible for the attacks and those who harbor them. Now, as for a sight setter here at the White House, you might expect, and that is the case, flags at half-staff all around the White House complex for what is likely to be a very somber day here. President Bush, as you know, quite the early riser, usually up by 5:30 a.m. This day expected to be no different. He will begin his day getting an up-to-date briefing from his national security team on the latest concerning the investigation, as well as the search and rescue efforts. He's also invited a group, bipartisan congressional leaders, over to the White House. And at that time, Mr. Bush will come before the cameras again. His message will be that the U.S. government is doing everything it can to assist in the disaster areas in New York, Pennsylvania, and then, of course, at the Pentagon here in Washington, D.C. He will also say that the work of the government goes on, and again, that the U.S. will do everything possible to find those responsible. Last night, the president went before the American people, a very grim-faced U.S. President George W. Bush, in what must have been obviously a very difficult moment for the president. He said that those responsible for what he called acts of mass murder were hoping to frighten the nation into, his words, chaos and retreat. But Mr. Bush said they have failed.
Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world. And no one will keep that light from shining.
Now, U.S. officials publicly and privately right now refuse to say exactly who they believe might be responsible for these attacks, but we do know that senior administration officials briefed members of Congress last night. Sources telling my colleague, CNN's John King, that those senior officials saying they are confident that the evidence is pointing to affiliates of accused terrorist Osama bin Laden. Also, those senior officials saying that they are going to take their time to make sure they find out exactly who is responsible and then, of course, hold them accountable. Carol?
Kelly, you have seen both sides of the coin on this story. You're obviously in Washington now, but you were in New York yesterday. What was that like?
Absolutely. Images that none of us will really ever forget. I was actually about 15 blocks from the World Trade Center complex when the first plane hit one of the towers and then went out on the streets. I think the images that really come to mind are people sort of leaving the downtown area in a very orderly manner, but calling on their cell phones, look of disbelief as people watching not one but two towers come down. And also, I talked to so many firefighters. It was an unbelievable situation, Carol. You couldn't use cell phones, really. You could barely get a call out. And so as I was holding my cell phone trying to get calls out, firefighters would come up and say, "Can I use your phone?" We said we couldn't get a call out, but we would take their names and numbers and then call their relatives or their loved ones. Obviously, they were very concerned to let their loved ones know that they were okay, but clearly firefighters were concerned about their colleagues. So many people saying that they had gone in, those firefighters had gone into those towers as the people were coming out, and many people that we talked to very concerned about the firefighters who, of course, went into those buildings, and, of course, what happened once those buildings came down.
That's
Carol?
right. Still 300 firefighters unaccounted for. How did you get out of the area?
That was another difficult thing because, as you know, airports were closed, Amtrak was down for most of the day, bridges and tunnels going into Manhattan were down, but by late in the afternoon, around 4, 5, 6, Amtrak started running, at least around 5 o'clock, started running trains out of Washington, so there was some opportunity to get out. A lot of commuters who needed to get away. Obviously, there were ferries taking people from downtown Manhattan over to New Jersey. Again, it was sort of a very orderly thing. People were moving from the downtown area, getting away from the scenes of destruction, and obviously very patient. A lot of crowds at Amtrak at Pennsylvania Station in Manhattan, but I can tell you too, Carol, how this hit so many people on the train from New York to Washington. There was one woman who had a friend of a friend who was on one of those planes that obviously went down. A man in front of me had a friend of a friend who was in an office above where one of those planes hit. So you can see how many lives these tragedies have affected.
And Kelly, what a strange situation for you to be in. I mean, you're a trained journalist, you're taught to be dispassionate, you're told time and again that you're not to be a part of the story, and yet here you were in a situation where you were almost part of the rescue operation and trying to give technical support and trying to flee as well with the crowds.
Yeah, I mean, Carol, as you know, it is impossible not to be affected by the scenes of firefighters sort of sitting on a curb, their heads in their hands, wondering, you know, about their colleagues. So it's hard to be affected. What was great is that we could be of some assistance. I mean, how happy some of these firefighters were to know that we just talked to their wife, or my boyfriend's mother was able to get through, and that they knew that their loved ones could then call all the relatives so that at least they had some comfort. But of course, you know, there's so many people who just questioning whether or not their loved ones are still alive, and it's just impossible. You just do the best you can, try to help, and get the story out. That was a major frustrating thing, Carol, though you couldn't get a cell phone to really work, so it was very difficult to call CNN New York or in Atlanta to convey what we were seeing, but that information was getting out throughout the day.
Right. Well, your instincts served you well, and I'm glad you're back safe home and now hard at work. Thank you very much. Kelly Wallace, reporting live from the White House. Vince?
We want to remind you we are just minutes away from a press conference that will be taking place at St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City. We'll get that as soon as they begin. But right now, with all due respect to the victims of this horrible tragedy, we want to see how the ramifications will affect now business in this country and worldwide. We go to David Haffenreffer, who's in New York, and he has that story. Good morning, David.
Good morning to you, Vince. As you might imagine, Lower Manhattan, the heart of the financial community. All financial markets obviously closed in the U.S. today. Even trading of U.S. stocks in London through the electronic trading firm Instinet have been halted. Let's take a
David, we have to interrupt you now, David. This is the press conference at St. Vincent's Hospital. We're taking that live.
FAL, Associate Director of the Trauma Center here at St. Vincent Catholic Medical Center. Let me first briefly update you on our numbers and what has happened during the night. and then Dr. Westphal can give you some information on our paramedics, our ambulances, what they've been doing, and what's been happening in the trauma center. Since 9:04 a.m. yesterday morning, St. Vincent Catholic Medical Center has received 361 individuals through our emergency room trauma center. 90 of those individuals have been admitted to St. Vincent's Manhattan. 4 of those individuals have died. 58 of the individuals who have come to St. Vincent are paramedics, firefighters, or police officers. We have 6 other hospitals in our system in Manhattan, Staten Island, Brooklyn, and Queens. Those hospitals received 42 additional patients, including 20 who were brought by barge over to St. Vincent, Staten Island. One of those individuals died at St. Vincent, Staten Island. Our paramedics were at the scene throughout the day yesterday. As you saw and continue to see, we are ready for what we hope will be additional survivors today. We are the closest trauma center, and thus if there are any miraculous recoveries from the wreckage, they will most likely be brought here. I'm going to ask Dr. Westphal to talk to you a bit about our paramedics and the work that they did, our ambulances, and the work that's happened in the trauma center, and then we'll take questions.
Thank you, Mark. Dr. Westphal, Associate Director of the Department of Emergency Medicine. Mr. Ackerman has mentioned the number of patients that we've had, the conditions, and the 4 deaths in Manhattan here. Our paramedics have had about 7 crews since 8 a.m. yesterday morning that have assisted Fidney EMS in obviously this massive undertaking of responding to critical trauma emergencies downtown. All of our crews have been able to participate and treat patients and move patients, and fortunately have not been injured or been critically injured themselves. We have in the emergency department right now all through the night a triple staff of nurses, physicians, physician assistants, and technical staff. The administrative senior management has been up, almost all of them throughout the night, and we've been prepared and are awaiting victims from the site as well. We are, as I think Mayor Giuliani has said over and over, we are very hopeful, we are prepared, and we are expecting to work very hard to resuscitate victims as they're brought here and brought to other hospitals. I know that through the night I've been told by OEM and Fidney that other major hospitals in Manhattan have been similar to ourselves, and we've really decompressed the emergency department, so we're prepared for major injuries, major trauma, as we have had throughout the day.
I'd like to note a couple of important things. We want to first thank all New Yorkers and people from literally throughout the world who came to the hospital yesterday to volunteer their services. Doctors, nurses, just people off the street. We had over 800 people in line at one point in time to give blood. The mayor's office was kind enough to provide buses so we could bring them to other sites to donate that blood. Today, we are still in need of blood. All of New York is in need of blood donations. You should go to the New York Blood Center or the Red Cross, and we will provide those addresses to you. We can't stress enough that thanks to all of the volunteers, our neighborhood residents here in Greenwich Village. Behind my left, there are still tables set up where neighborhood residents are making sandwiches, bringing food. It's truly unbelievable, the outpouring of New Yorkers and the help that they have been. If anyone wants to give blood, we will provide that information to you. We've also received an inordinate amount of clothing through the night. We are very grateful for that, but we are really not in any need of any more of that right now. So we would just like to thank folks for that. It is very important to note that the trauma of this, from a psychological perspective, is going to be hitting New Yorkers more and more today. We particularly encourage parents to talk with their children. I went home for a few hours last night, and I have to tell you, at 2 o'clock in the morning, my teenage children and younger needed to talk. And it's very important that we encourage all parents to do that. In an effort to help with that, we have 3 mental health hotlines that are manned 24 hours a day. We will provide you with those numbers as well. There are many mental health crisis lines. We encourage all New Yorkers to take advantage of this. We have all suffered a terrible trauma in this city. We need to understand it and our feelings and to talk about it. So we encourage New Yorkers to take advantage of these. We have facilities in Westchester, Manhattan, and Staten Island that are manned 24 hours a day for this. We can take questions. There were no additional survivors brought here during the night. We did receive a number of firefighters, police officers, and paramedics, again, mostly with the corneal abrasions and literally lacerations on their hands. I don't know exactly what time it was, but during the night, we did receive the firefighters and paramedics. Yeah, I'll let Dr. Westfall speak to that.
Yes. Well, I don't know about amputation, but to provide additional medical care, we did. We had about 2 crews of about a dozen doctors that went down to there to assist with treating patients. We also had a group, I believe, of about 4 physicians that went up to the Javits Center very late in the night to treat additional patients that were brought there, as they had requested help. I cannot speak for that. I'm not aware.
Sir, how would you characterize your efforts to try to get people from Ground Zero? Are you frustrated by the debris you see there at this point? Were you able to get them out of there with the kinds of swiftness?
Speaking for our paramedics that have been there all during the day, along with Fidney's paramedics and all other hospitals' paramedics, and if I could just echo what Mr. Ackerman said, I can't believe the number of hundreds of vehicles and ambulances that have responded from the tri-state area and all the metropolitan areas. I've seen Jersey, Connecticut, I've seen Westchester ambulances that have all come. The thing I'd mention with the effort, I think from the very beginning, they have been working in the areas around the Trade Center and have not been inhibited. Obviously, for periods of time, our paramedics, I think all paramedics, were kept away from the buildings as they had a judgment that they were going to be coming down. So that was inhibited, but all through the night, they were assisting firefighters and other crews that were trying to extricate patients and then make judgments as to where they would bring them for care that was appropriate.
Do you expect to see a different kind of injury today as opposed to the sort of injuries you saw yesterday and last night?
Well, I think we would expect to see the victims that we would get today would probably have a number of problems besides the trauma and the injuries that they'd have, which would probably be more severe. We expect to see dehydrations and other complications of that haven't been underneath for probably almost 24 hours right now.
You talked about trauma. How's your own staff, particularly since Elmer's coming? You talked about trauma. How are they doing?
Well, our staff, from the standpoint of our trauma team here, ourselves.
Psychological trauma.
Yeah.
How is your staff holding up, particularly since survivors?
Right. Our administrative staff, nurses and physicians have been assisted all throughout the 24 hours by our Department of Psychiatry, by our pastoral care, by our priests and sisters that have been down there, not just for the patients, but for our staff entirely. And we've had a couple of individuals that have needed time to sit down and talk with them and to cry with them, and that's happened throughout the day.
I think it's just important to note too that a number of our nurses and physicians are married to firefighters and police officers, and they worked throughout the day yesterday and the night not knowing where their loved ones were. We're very grateful that all of our paramedics that were at the scene and physicians and nurses are okay. We did lose an ambulance. One of our ambulances was crushed in the debris, but our hearts certainly go out to our colleagues in the fire department and in the police department and all of the other victims. Just one at a time, please. One more, and then we'll go.
About anybody else who might be coming,
We have not gotten any information about new victims coming to us. Sure. We have in our system, entire system, 2,600 beds throughout the city. Yesterday we were able to transfer some of our patients to other sites, discharge patients appropriately, and then we opened up as many beds as possible here. We still have bed availability here. Sure.
Yeah, of the patients who came in, again, over 361, right, we had, again, as was mentioned, we had 5 patients expire, 2 who came in what we call traumatic arrest from the injury, needing CPR coming in the door. Those patients both expired in the emergency department. A firefighter came in with major injuries and chest pain and went to the operating room and expired there. And then we had another individual come in during the night, during the morning hours with severe burns, who ended up expiring upstairs in our surgical ICU. 5th person was, as Mr. Ackerman mentioned, was brought to Staten Island, St. Vincent's, and expired there. I can tell you we had 50 major traumas and major injuries, and I can tell you, unfortunately, I happened to be here in '93 when we had the other World Trade Center disaster. I can tell you then, throughout the city, there were 10 deaths from that disaster, and here we had the first victim. That time we had 1 death the entire time. And you folks will know better than I the hundreds and perhaps thousands of people that may die from that.
So that is the word from St. Vincent's Hospital to this point, and we are looking again at these live pictures from ground zero, basically, and I wonder if we can possibly find some of these workers, whether they're firefighters or otherwise. Maybe we could pan down there just to give people some idea of the scale of this tremendous debris that's been left behind. There you go. And just the massive undertaking that this will be. Right, massive in the sense that St. Vincent's is saying that they received more than 400 patients at not only their hospital but their associated hospitals. 5 people out of that has passed away. 5 people have passed away, but what they clearly are doing is bracing for many, many more people. They have more than 2,500 beds available. They're not full yet. And they're saying that this is an internal family crisis for them, that many of their nurses and paramedics are married to firefighters. Some 300 firefighters are still unaccounted for. So while they're trying to treat hundreds of people who have been victimized by this terrorist attack, they also are worrying about their own and waiting to hear word about their husbands and wives who may be trapped in that rubble as we look at it there. Well, they have gone to triple staff there, and again, seeking blood. They want blood donors to help in that New York City area. And they talked about a huge outpouring. They had 800 people standing in line yesterday offering to donate blood, and they're saying that they have information there at St. Vincent's for people to go to the New York Blood Center or to go to the Red Cross. They do need more blood donations. They do not need any more clothing donations, but I think it's just a sense of New Yorkers wanting to try to help and contribute during this time of crisis. And that was duly noted. Duly noted. At the press conference. Let's go back now. David Haffenreffer is with us from New York, and is going to bring us up to speed on the effect for the financial world. David.
Indeed, Vince. Thank you. All the financial markets, as you might imagine, closed in the U.S. today. Even trading of U.S. stocks that trade over the electronic trading firm Instinet have been halted. European markets are open for business at this early hour. Early in the session, many of the major indices were at 3-year lows. They moved back into positive territory at one point, but have, for the most part, turned negative once again. Here's a look at the latest figures at this point. In London, the FT 100 index is basically unchanged at this point. We've got the Xetra DAX index in Frankfurt down by 28 points. In Paris, the CAC 40 lower by 71 points, a decline of 1.6%. The Zurich Swiss Market Index now lower by 1.1%. A look at how the dollar is trading against the other major global currencies. And the Bank of England has, says the U.S. Federal Reserve has now urged central banks to limit dollar trading to help cut back on the turmoil in the financial markets. We should note that the dollar fell about 2% versus the euro yesterday after the incident in downtown Manhattan. At this point, we've got the euro weaker, down about a third of a cent there at 90 cents and change. We've got the pound trading at 1.46 and the dollar trading a bit higher versus the Japanese yen, 119.58 Japanese yen. Asian markets are now closed for the day, but here is how they ended the session overnight. We had the Nikkei 225 index in Tokyo lower by about 6%. Hang Seng Index in Hong Kong lower by 8%. All these declines sparking some concerns about a possible recession here in the United States. In fact, Sonia Gibbs, the chief equity strategist at Nomura Securities in London, telling us this morning that consumer confidence is expected to be hurt in the United States because of all these terrorist attacks, and that could take a big chunk out of the U.S. gross domestic product figures through the end of the year. Vince and Carol, back to you.
Thank you, David. We keep hearing that word recession, and certainly we'll be in touch with you throughout the days ahead. Carol?
Reverberations on Wall Street and markets around the world, as well as people on both sides of the Middle East conflict. They are watching the U.S. very closely today. Both Israeli and Palestinian officials are denouncing yesterday's atrocity, but not all are sympathetic with American victims. More now from CNN's Jerusalem Bureau Chief Mike Hanna.
Intense security around the U.S. Embassy in Israel, and residents in a region that suffered incessant violence watch closely the unfolding tragedy in the United States. As news of the attacks spread, in East Jerusalem and Nablus, some took to the streets in celebration. Isolated groups of Palestinians who view the U.S. as an enemy because of its perceived support for Israel. But radical Palestinian groups denied any involvement in the planning or execution of the tragic events, and Palestinian leaders condemned the attacks in the strongest of terms, offering the deepest commiserations to the American people.
It is very difficult for me personally, for anyone, to speak about what had happened. It is not only against the Americans. It is not only against the American people or against the American government. It is against the whole international human being.
Condemnation and commiseration, too, from the Israeli government.
In this most difficult hour, all Israelis stand as one with the American people. Our hearts are with you, and we are ready to provide any assistance at any time.
Several hours after the attacks, Israel announced it was closing its airspace to all international flights, apart from its own El Al airline. In addition, Israel has closed all land crossings into neighboring countries. This not in response to any specific threats, say security sources, but a general tightening of already intense security. Mike Hanna, CNN, Jerusalem.
A diverse reaction out of the Middle East. Right now we go to Ms. Hanan Ashrari. She is a Palestinian spokesperson. Good morning, Ms. Ashrari. I'd just like to get your reaction to what is now being characterized as the worst terrorist attack on U.S. soil.
It certainly is. I think it's the worst terrorist attack in the history of humanity, and it's a blow to humanity as a whole. It's a crime that is of just absolute immorality and evil. And may I take this opportunity to extend on behalf of the Palestinian people and the Arabs as a whole, our deep sense of grief, our, I don't know how to say it, our condolences to the American people and our identification with their pain and with their sorrow. This is entirely unconscionable. This is something that has struck deep in the hearts and minds of every human being, every person who recognizes the need for a moral imperative and for a human identification. And to the victims, their families, their friends, to the American people as a whole, we stand with you and by you, and we feel your pain.
An axe struck deep indeed, as every American feels this morning, and yet right now I'm going to show our domestic audience here, our audience actually worldwide, these pictures out of Ramallah yesterday. As you say these words, how do you account for these Palestinians who are dancing in the streets celebrating this attack against the United States?
I think this is entirely misleading. I know before people understood the implications or what was happening, they didn't understand. Some people reacted, and they're a minority. children, people who didn't understand. Once people understood the magnitude and understood what actually did happen, I know from the people I saw, I spoke to, from the leadership, from President Arafat on down, to civil society, to people in the street, to the leadership of the Intifada, they all expressed horror, they all expressed condemnation, they all expressed grief. But you cannot sort of choose a minority and a moment in which people didn't understand in order to malign the majority or to color the Palestinian people in a to label them in a way which is entirely unfair and unjust. People felt maybe this was a political thing, they didn't know that this was an act of terrorism. And once people understood, they were unanimous in their condemnation, in their sorrow, and in their shock. I've heard this personally myself, I've talked to many people, and I really would appreciate it if you wouldn't choose the initial response and the minority response in order to generalize. This has been exploited enough to malign the Palestinians and to put us as though we are condoning this act, even though we as victims ourselves, we feel nothing but sympathy to the American victims and to humanity as a whole. We feel that we have a common bond. We are being shelled and killed daily. We are living in a state of siege. Last night, 11 Palestinians were shot and killed, shelled to bits and pieces. Over 100 are wounded. Ambulances cannot get to them. So even from the depth of our own sorrow and victimization, we reach out in genuine identification to the American people, and we say, we feel your pain, we feel your sorrow, and we will do everything possible, if can, to join you in attempting to combat such an evil that is an evil against everything that is human and moral, against everybody who's struggling for freedom, for dignity, for human rights.
Ms. Ashrawi, it is very possible that more American lives have been lost in this terrorist attack, in this tragedy, than even the countless number of Arab lives, even in the last 5 years. How is this tragedy likely to change the dynamic on the ground in the Middle East now?
I think this tragedy, even though we don't measure human lives quantitatively, every single life is important, is unique, and is irreplaceable. But I think this tragedy has changed the course of human history. I think the full implications will not be understood immediately. It has to be, the situation has to be studied, depending also on the perpetrators that must be found and must be held accountable and must be punished. I believe that it will have implications for global perceptions and definitions of who's an enemy and who's a friend. Such an invisible enemy that can strike anywhere, and with such professionalism, with such deliberation, having so many resources and capabilities. This is astounding. It is absolutely horrific, and it changes the dynamic of human relations and, of course, enmities and friendships and alliances beyond national boundaries. This has to be a collective human endeavor. And I think it should also give us an added impetus, particularly in the Middle East, to solve these problems, to solve our conflicts, to end an occupation, to try to create a situation where we can join forces against evil rather than constantly be parts of a perpetual cycle of victimization.
Ms. Ashrawi, that's
this
exactly.
Has to give us greater energy and commitment.
Absolutely. That is exactly what the Bush administration will be asking for today around the world. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Hanan Ashrawi, spokesperson for the Palestinian Authority. Vince?
Well, it is 8 minutes before the hour of 7 a.m. Eastern Time in New York City, the morning after. We have more pictures to offer you as rescue workers continue to work furiously, hoping against hope to find survivors of Tuesday's terrible ordeal. We also understand that former President Bill Clinton is in Australia, and we are able now to give to you his reaction to yesterday's turn of events.
We are grieving with and supporting the families affected, and secondly, we're not going to let it beat us. We're going to rebuild, and we're going to go on, and we're not going to look the other way. And like I said, the country, I thought, was very well represented, our values, our ideals, and our interests by what the President said last night. I thought it was an excellent statement, and I think all of us should support it.
Have you spoken to the President?
Again now, President Bill Clinton responding to what happened, and we want to show you again, this is morning now in Manhattan, Ground Zero, former site of where the World Trade Center once stood. And again, the fire's burning, and rescue workers, firefighters, police, emergency people on hand, and sifting through that horrible carnage.
And reports this morning, Vince, that rescuers are hearing the voices of people who were trapped underneath the rubble. They have a sense that there are people alive, and reports on New York radio of people inside the rubble trapped and talking to rescuers, talking to family members on their cell phones as they wait and wonder if rescue will come in time. Fires are still burning in that rubble as we speak. You know, you talk about what the situation is on the ground, and you get a sense of people suffering and the tragedy and the panic yesterday. CNN's Deborah Fayrick takes a look at the victims and, in particular, the firefighters lost.
Many of the 300 firefighters missing and feared dead were believed to be inside the World Trade Center when it collapsed.
I can't find anybody from 5 rescues and 7 squads, and it's just it's a devastating thing. I don't know. Well, the fire department will recover, but I don't know how.
Arriving first on scene, they ran into the burning towers, carrying hoses and trying to get people to safety.
The horror of it all is all the first alarm, second alarm, third alarm, fifth alarm companies. They're all in there. And there's a lot of companies are wiped out, from what I understand.
Fire engines were crushed, a strategic command center silenced, and several of the highest-ranking fire officials buried beneath tons of dust and steel.
I don't know what to say. We lost people that have given over 40 years.
Those who got out in time went back, injuries and all, to search for their friends. Others off duty grabbed their gear and raced to help dig out any possible survivors.
My brother works in the 91st floor. My brother, and he's unaccounted for at this time. So I'm just, doing a lot of praying.
Praying amidst an unnatural silence.
That's probably what amazed me the most. There was no people to be seen. Even the dogs couldn't find people.
At firehouses in Manhattan, there were flowers and mourning as everyone waited, holding out hope.
They should have been here already. The rig is not back. They're not back. They should have been back.
More than 30 police officers also died. Choking back tears, several firefighters summed up the catastrophe.
These are your buddies.
We lost a lot of friends today. A lot of friends.
A loss that will be shared by all New Yorkers. Deborah Fayrick, CNN, New York.
Vince, we've got a wide shot which gives the context and the perspective of the damage of the World Trade Center, which no longer exists now. Those twin towers crushed. That is the rubble that you're seeing between apartment buildings and high-rises which remain in the surrounding area as the rescue efforts still go on.
You know, as we look at this, I can't help but think this is not somewhere else in the world. This is New York City, USA. And we are seeing this on our soil, on our turf. And it's still difficult to digest almost a day later.
As we watch the sun rise over this devastation, knowing that there are likely still people alive, as we've been hearing this morning. Rescue workers are saying that they do hear voices underneath that rubble as they try to get to people on time. They still have no idea how many people are trapped, how many people killed, but they are very sure that it is in the thousands. This is obviously the heart of the financial center of the world, and in Washington, the devastation to the central military operation in the United States, the Pentagon. If we can take that live picture, if we have it available, still fires, Vince, burning there this morning.
You can see some of the damage. You can have that Pentagon live shot. You see some of the damage there as well, and there it is. As firefighters still working, and as you mentioned, Carol, fire still burning there, and just a chunk of those of that ring, of the rings that surround the Pentagon, taken away. Carol.
5 stories there and several stories underneath, and this jet plane plowing into, as you said, the inner circle of the Pentagon, this military complex. And we will be obviously covering this throughout the day. 800 people, they think, died at the Pentagon alone, but still counting the devastation and the damage there. We leave you now this morning as our coverage continues, remembering the victims of this tragic terrorist attack.